Hopefully I won't have too much trouble getting my slides to work today. All right. So moving on in time, we sort of dealt with the Civil War on the last time we talked about history, and wrapped up with Reconstruction, what was going on in the South, the devastation there, issues with the recently freed slaves, and sort of that perpetuation of racism and sort of suppressing Black rights through voting. At the even before the end of Reconstruction, we consider the end period of the 19th century in the U.S., the Gilded Age, from 1870 to 1900. And there was still a lot of economic trouble in the South during that time, but the rest of the United States was seeing quite a lot of economic growth, and really things were taking off. So I mentioned here what helped with that was the Transcontinental Railroad. So from coast to coast, we had a railway line, so you can move people, who are wanting to move maybe to the West Coast, seeking new opportunities, and of course, goods are able to travel across from one side of the U.S. to the other, nonstop, just one train. So this is all, and what we're going to see out of that is a lot of economic growth. I mentioned, early on, even early on in the 1800s, right? We have these two big oceans that keep people from, or keep other nations from harassing us at the time. So, and we were sort of isolationists. We weren't really concerned with the rest of the world, outside of trade. So we were just growing, and the growth from building. There was a number of people that were able to accumulate insane amount of wealth. So guys like Andrew Carnegie, who was a steel baron, is Andrew Mellon. I can't remember his first name, Mellon, which was a big banker at the time. The Vanderbilt family, which was the major railroad company. There was others, and we'll talk about why they sort of succeeded where others didn't. The Rockefellers and Standard Oil, and so much of that was back into building the U.S. But you had these huge companies now. Wages grew crazy fast in the United States, above the rest of the world. So your workers' wages were going up, but that is going to cause a little bit of an issue too, because there's still wealth disparity. Huge mass immigration, people wanting to come to the United States. This is where the idea of land of opportunity really starts to come into play, particularly from your European nations. Still Ireland, there's huge immigration from Ireland, Scotland, Germany now, Italy. And they're coming here. A lot of them are still working, those very hard labor, blue collar jobs. But the opportunity here is better than what they have in Europe. But there is also, like I said, this growth in wealth disparity. The men of those days that built America. There's actually I think it's on the History Channel. There was a series called the Men Who Made America or something like that, and they discuss a lot of these individuals. Like I mentioned, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Mellon. These guys they were, for their day, stupid rich, like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and those guys are today. If you compare the numbers, obviously, because we're talking about the American dollar in the late 1800s as opposed to what it means today, but they're on par, if not more rich, and have accumulated more wealth than who we talk about today as these super rich billionaires. In some cases, they were philanthropists. Andrew Carnegie, particularly if you go around the Western Pennsylvania area, around Pittsburgh. Of course, there's Carnegie Mellon University, but he also set up libraries. He set up museums. So he did give back quite a bit. But we see now this disparity between the working class and their wages and the wealthy up here. So we're going to start seeing a lot of push towards unionizing. We're going to see a push towards that 40-hour work week, certain types of benefits, and just reduction and improvement in working conditions, because safety is a big issue as well. One way that a lot of these men made their money was by using some unethical business practices. We mentioned monopolies before, where if you are the sole possessor of a product that everybody needs, then you get to set the price for it. And there was attempts, some successful ones, and eventually the government had to step in the 1900s, particularly during Teddy Roosevelt's presidency in the early 1900s, to crack down on a lot of these unethical business practices. So one thing they would do is collusion, where you would get multiple companies. This is still a problem today, by the way. So they through various practices will push out competition. They secure themselves from having any competitors. I just actually found out that Ben and Jerry's ice cream and Haagen-Dazs collude. And this is a lot less sinister than what guys were doing at this time, but there's an agreement between Haagen-Dazs ice cream and Ben and Jerry's. So if you notice, Ben and Jerry's ice cream always has like a bunch of add-ins, right? Like brownie and cookie dough and chocolate chips, nuts, all this stuff. It's always a chunky ice cream, right? Chunky Monkey. That's one of my wife's favorites. But there's always stuff in it. Haagen-Dazs concentrates on flavors. If you ever notice, they don't have a lot of things inside their ice cream. And you'll notice this next time you go to the grocery store and you pass by the ice cream aisle. So they've colluded. So that's like, they don't take up, if you want like something with a bunch of mix-ins in it, you're going to go to Ben and Jerry's. If you just want a nice smooth ice cream with maybe a different flavor, you go to Haagen-Dazs. So they don't compete for the same type of ice cream lover. I'll eat any of it though. But in this time though, in the late 19th century, there's competition. There's other, much more sinister. Even in today's world, I think it was Google and Amazon at one point colluded together not to hire each other's employees, like a no competition, so that way they could keep wages low. Things like that was happening at that time. You would have the Vanderbilt family. I can't remember. Cornelius Vanderbilt, I think, was the head of the family. The railroad magnate that owned the railways colluded with the Rockefellers and Standard Oil. So they agreed. It's like, hey, I will exclusively use your railroads for transporting my oil if you do not sign contracts with other oil producers, right? Price fixing that we talked about. So let's say this happened recently in, this happens quite a bit, but so let's say you have, 4 or 5 companies that sell the same product, the same type of product. They will collude and agree that they will not undercut each other and drop their prices to a certain point. So they artificially inflate the price. Actually, there's a King of the Hill episode where all the propane people around Arlington, Texas, all the sellers collude to bring their prices up. So this is all unethical. and it's driving out other competition. That's the one big problem with it. So you create monopolies, and that's one reason that these guys were able to. Now, in some cases, they were innovators. They brought new products. They were great at marketing. But on the other hand, one of the ways that they accumulate a lot of wealth was through some unethical practices. And at that time, they didn't even really consider it. That they were driving out competition. So they're kind of dealing with that. We're dealing with early labor issues, some strikes and protests to get better working conditions, eliminate unpaid, well, not unpaid overtime, but additional wages for overtime, like your time and a half, paid holidays and things like that will be promoted by unions. So finally we get towards the end, and there's some ups and downs. I mentioned the panic of 1873, where the price of cotton fell. That hurt the South, but things go pretty strong in the West. The economy in the North is pretty strong. And at the end of the 1800s, there's the Spanish-American War in 1898. So there is Cuba is still a colony of Spain, and they are fighting for their independence from Spain. There is a American naval ship that is in the harbor in Cuba, the USS Maine, and there is an explosion on board, most likely, and what's fairly come to be concluded is that it was an internal explosion, maybe like an ammunition explosion or fuel or something like that. But American newspapers got a hold of that and claimed that Spain had fired on the ship. And that draws the U.S. into the war. So we are fighting the Spanish alongside of the native Cubans. And we win. We whip them pretty good. And there's war on two fronts. Where most of that happens in Cuba, but there's also they have control of the Philippines. And as a result of that war, the Spanish-American War, Spain cedes. We've talked about this before when it comes to the territory of the U.S. Right? Once we won a war. Once we won like the American Revolution, Britain ceded territory to us. So Spain basically hands over Cuba and the Philippines to the United States. Spain, was just, we've talked about Britain as far as this, and they're still the big powerhouse around the world. But, Spain was holding on to some territories, but their colonial empire had really been struggling, even before the American Revolution. And this was one of their territories that they were still holding on to. But the United States takes control. As far as Cuba goes, it's a military government that they place there, and it's temporary. They are working to basically give Cuba its independence at this time. There's like a provisional government. They kind of become a protectorate of the United States becomes a protectorate of Cuba for a little while. The Philippines, on the other hand, becomes U.S. territory. Not long after we finish the Spanish-American War, the U.S. turns around and fights a war in the Philippines against forces that are fighting for independence. So the question becomes then, after fighting for our own independence, the U.S. fighting for its own independence in the 1770s and 1780s, now here we are with territory that does not necessarily belong to the United States, that we basically inherited from another country, and it brings the question up: is America creating an empire? Are we a colonial empire now because we have these territories? And so there's some paradox, right? Because we've always sort of promoted this idea of self-government and independence. Our independence, the American Revolution sparked revolutions around the world. a lot of those against Britain and France. France had its own revolution not long after ours. Haiti went through a revolution against France. And they all sort of pointed back to what the United States had done against Britain to win their independence. And now here the United States is at the turn of the century with territory, and they're actually fighting against revolutionaries in the Philippines. So that question's always sort of lingered here. And we still have territories today, like Puerto Rico and American Samoa and some other island nations that belong to the U.S. that we have not granted we haven't granted statehood to. Okay, so the other thing that comes about because of the Spanish-American War and our growing economy and the wealth that the United States has accumulated, the end of the 18th or 19th century, going into the 1900s, is sort of the United States coming out party as a world power. Just an economic powerhouse. We have resources, just by the ton. We've sort of secured our own borders. We finally kicked Spain out of our hemisphere, and so we're the United States is still not that involved in world affairs. We don't really care what's going on in Europe. We're not going to get involved in wars, but economically, everybody's looking at the United States and go, wow, what's going on over there is pretty crazy. They're really, they're going gangbusters in the United States. So it was, a lot going on. And, by winning that war against Spain, it kind of concerned even, Britain and some of the other European powers. It's like, well, we need to sort of keep our eye on those guys because, who knows what happens? They might just become a military power and want to take over the world. So that's one reason Great Britain becomes our best friend, because they basically hand down their status as the world superpower to the United States eventually. All right, so then let's talk about World War I. The United States continues, down its path of economic progress. And things in Europe are getting really tense by the time we get to the second decade of the 20th century. So for one, the thing about World War I, it's very complicated as far as how everything gets started. How do we get embroiled in this global war? But a few of the elements that were really important there is the alignment of what we call the great powers, the big European countries, the rich European countries, and the military powers there. So the Triple Entente, that consists of Great Britain, France, and Russia. So, if you listen to the news today, you'll hear something, things about NATO, particularly when it comes to Ukraine. NATO is this big alliance. It's this big security collective of, the United States, Great Britain, France, Italy, a lot of Western Europe. And that was one contentious point. Was there was an idea at one time of putting Ukraine into NATO, which would obviously pull all of those countries into a war if Ukraine was attacked. I mentioned this, I think, maybe before. The only time NATO has ever actually invoked what they call Article 5 is when they go to war when a nation is attacked, is during 9/11. So that was considered an attack on the United States, and the war in Afghanistan was a NATO mission. That's why you had Germans there and Latvians and all of these little countries sent troops. A lot of them were support, but there was a lot of different nations that served in that war. So here it's kind of the same thing, where Great Britain, France, and Russia are like, okay, if something happens, if Germany comes and picks on you, Russia or France, then Great Britain and France is going to jump into the war. The Triple Alliance is very similar, but it's Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And there's also other, countries that may be aligned with one of those nations, but not necessarily with the others. And that's what's going to cause a complication as we get down the road here. Militarism and nationalism in this time are huge aspects of the culture in these European powers. Nationalism, I mentioned in the Middle Ages, nobody identified as French or British or Russian. These were you had your own little local community, and you had a duke or something, and that was there wasn't any type of national pride. There wasn't any idea that we talk about exceptionalism, American exceptionalism, that our way is the best way and it's worked best for us and it will work great for everybody else and all that. So there's these ideas of exceptionalism, being British is the best thing ever, being French is the best thing ever, being German is the best thing ever, pushing ideas of nationalism. And I mentioned this before too, when somebody, mentions nationalism today, people, any historian's like, whoa, that's got us in trouble before. Do you really want to start throwing that word around? And then a really, gross version of that is white nationalism, which we unfortunately hear about today. The idea of white supremacy and a all white sort of nation. But just that general term of nationalism. It's one thing to have pride in your country. It's one thing to identify as an American or, whatever the country is culturally and things like that. But when you start stressing how great your country is and perhaps better than other countries, well, you're going to see what happens here. Militarism. So military culture was also really popular. The Boy Scouts is part of that. This is the creation of scouting, Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. Boy Scouts come along first, and just the idea of teaching boys these types of skills, building fires and this martial kind of self-reliance, but also along with that, just this crazy amount of money put into expanding military research as far as weapons, just absolute incredibly destructive weapons that are developed before World War I. So then what actually sparks the war? And so the Archduke Franz Ferdinand visits Bosnia in June in the summer of 1914. So he is the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so he's visiting Bosnia. It's on the map today. It's Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was part of Yugoslavia for a number of years, and then when that split up, and that is sort of in the southern part, southeastern part of Europe. And he is assassinated by a Bosnian, an ethnic Bosnian Serb. They had been overtaken by the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1908. And of course, there's some Bosnian nationalists that were very upset about that. So while visiting Sarajevo, which is one of the major cities there, he is assassinated. And it's a really wild, like there's a car chase and people chasing after him. And it was just, the thing went on for like hours before he was assassinated and getting chased and hiding and all this stuff was going on. But so how do you get to war then? Well, he is the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They are aligned with Germany. They're aligned with Italy. They're also aligned with the Ottoman Empire. So they're going to go to war against the Serbs, Bosnia. and those nationalists are aligned with Russia. Not aligned with Great Britain and France necessarily, but they're aligned with Russia. So the Austria-Hungarian War is going to pull in Germany and Italy and sink them down because they're aligned, right? So they're going to join the war. Russia is going to help out the Serbs, which is going to bring France and Great Britain into the war. So now all of the powers are going to wind up fighting. The Triple Entente is going to fight against the Triple Alliance. Now, part of the problem here is this nationalism. Everybody's actually rooting for war. Everybody's ready to go to war. Had it not been Franz Ferdinand that was assassinated, there would have been some other match point. There would have been something else that happened. Somebody would have said something, they would have crossed the wrong border. Something would have set these nations off. War was coming. It just happened to be Ferdinand, his death that sort of sparked it. But the rest of the summer was kind of quiet. There wasn't a lot of activity. A lot of the world leaders were on vacation at that time. They were out, on their yachts and everything. So it didn't really necessarily have immediate effect. They didn't go to war June 29th, 1914. It actually took several months. When we get to war, and as I mentioned, everybody's sort of rooting for war. People in Britain are ready to go to war. People in France are ready to go to war. And there was this idea that it was going to be done by Christmas. They were going to go to war late summer, early fall, and the troops would be home by Christmas. We were just going to deal with all of this. The problem is, like I mentioned before, how devastating war technology was at that time. Nothing had ever, we never seen anything like this before. Trench warfare. If you watch a movie on Neil, you asked me about Civil War movies. I'm still trying to think, but if you want to see a good World War I movie, 1917. It came out pretty recently, just a few years ago. So check that out. But they dug trenches. The problem was, like I mentioned, the devastating military technology that had been advanced in the last several decades since the last time there was a fairly sizable war between two big powers. Machine guns, right? So just spraying bullets was a fairly new invention. Barbed wire, so you could set up barbed wire, and it made it nearly impossible for a opposing force to cross because they're going to get stuck in the barbed wire. They're going to get cut up by the barbed wire. And chemical weapons, so things like mustard gas were used that would burn your skin and burn your lungs and your throat. And there's other types of chemical weapons that were used as well. Artillery, just devastating artillery fire and all of this. So what wound up happening, these two sides, particularly on the there was two fronts, but on the Western front, it fell into trench warfare. So to hide yourself from the artillery fire and the machine gun fire, you dug trenches, so you'd hide down in the trenches. If you ever heard of trench foot, because these things stayed wet, the soldiers, their feet would never dry, and they would get infections and things on their feet. It was horrible. Just the whole environment is absolutely horrible, and they spent years in these environments. But so it turned into a stalemate. One side dug in these trenches on one side. You had trenches several hundred yards away for the opposing force on the other. And in between, and you've heard this phrase before, no man's land. That's where that idea comes from. There's barbed wire, and you walk out into that, you're going to get hit with machine gun fire and artillery. It's just devastating. So, moving and making any progress, it took months to just travel maybe feet to, get closer to your enemy. So that idea that it was going to wrap up before Christmas soon fades, and they see that it's going to just be this ongoing, just meat grinder of losses and these stalemates. Just like there was for a long time. It's just, is there going to be an end in sight? You can still go to Europe, and they still find shells, artillery shells from World War I. You can see the trenches that were dug in aerial photography and things still, and that's still even after World War II. Yeah, just incredibly devastating. So there is a tipping point when the United States enters the war, and it takes a lot of coaxing to get the United States to go to war. Like I said, the United States were isolationists. They were not very concerned about Europe. They didn't want to get involved. That was the national sentiment. But a few things happen, and the United States just can't ignore it anymore. And Woodrow Wilson decides to go to war. One of those, just generally speaking, is submarine warfare in the Atlantic Ocean. Germans are using submarines to attack ships. They do this in World War II as well. But here, at first, there's an agreement. It's like, okay, we're not going to attack passenger ships, but we are going to attack any type of military ship. So that puts constraints on as far as our shipping. It concerns that they're going to attack our ships. And then they sink a passenger liner, which it was a British ship called the Lusitania, but there was American passengers on it. And that infuriated a lot of Americans at the time. Lo and behold, it also did have weapons on it that were being transported secretly. But at the time, this is one of those things. It's like, okay, we just can't let this go. Another one, which is kind of funny, is the Zimmerman telegram, and that's what the political cartoon here is referencing. So Zimmerman was I forget Arthur Zimmerman. He's German, obviously. He was a diplomat, I believe. Or maybe worked in government, but he was a high-ranking official in Germany. Let's just put it that way. He sends a telegram to Mexico and tells them that if the United States enters World War I on the side of Great Britain, France, Russia, that the German Germany, will assist them in recovering Arizona, Mexico, and Texas, those states, as Mexican territory, right? If they enter the war, you attack them. You'll have an opportunity to get back your territory that you ceded to them, and Germany will help. Well, there's a couple problems with this idea. For one, Mexico is in the middle of a revolution itself. There's just no way that they could, mobilize and try to attack the United States. So the idea here is pretty silly to start with. Second, this is great. So the telegram, there's one cable basically, or maybe a series of cables, but in order to send a telegram from Europe to the United States, it has to travel across a cable at this point. We've already laid cable across the Atlantic Ocean, the floor of the ocean, from one side to the other to send telegrams. So we have basically, instantaneous communication with Europe now. But it's owned by the United States and Britain. So to send a message to Mexico, it has to go to Great Britain and then go to the German embassy in the United States and then to Mexico. So Britain sees this message as like, oh, wow, Germany is trying to get Mexico to start a war with the United States. So Britain obviously offers this information to the United States. Not really smart on the part of this German of Zimmerman, thinking he's going to be able to send a telegram to the United States through Great Britain and not have it intercepted and delivered to the American government. So that really infuriates the American people that Germany is plotting behind the United States with Mexico. So eventually, the U.S. raises forces and officially enters the war in April 1917, which is really fortunate for the Triple Entente because Russia leaves the war in March 1918. At the same time, they're going through a revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. You might hear, for instance, the October Revolution, the Red Revolution, where basically communists take control. Vladimir Lenin, that you have probably heard of, takes control. They oust the monarchy. They're assassinated. The monarchy is assassinated, and install a new government. This is where the beginning of the USSR, of the Soviet Union. But because of the internal turmoil in Russia, they actually sign a treaty with Germany to exit the war. So it's like, hey, we're going to leave, but Germany, if we sign a treaty with you, don't continue to attack us. So that allowed Germany to pull its troops away from the Eastern Front and focus on the Western Front. But with the new U.S. troops, that was sort of the tipping point for the Allies. With the inclusion of fresh troops and weapons, they were able to tip the scale and win the war. So the aftermath, looking at the numbers here, up to an estimated 23.6 million dead. That's combined as far as soldiers, military, and civilians. So you can see, only about 8 million combat deaths. So actually, fighting, which is still crazy because we talked about how many deaths there were in the Civil War, and this is just however many times factored above that. 2.2. This is really disturbing, and it also changes sort of the face of war. 2.2 million civilian deaths by military action. Your wars past, you didn't have a lot of targeting civilians. Now they're becoming fair game, and I mentioned this earlier. This idea of total war that's going to encompass World War I and World War II, where it's fair game to go after civilians because they're considered part of your war-making capacity. Things like factories, those become primary targets in war. Fuel depots and all of this stuff that's also part of the civilian world. So civilians become part of the war as far as deaths. So we see a huge increase in the number of civilian deaths. And then 6 million civilian deaths from malnutrition and disease. Still yet, even at this time, with the increase in weapon technology and all that, disease and malnutrition kills more people in this time frame than anything else. Of course, because of the war effort, because the inability to get food to people starve to death. And the other problem here is that spread of disease. So the Spanish flu, which we've discussed, well, I'm sure you've heard about because of COVID, we heard a lot about the Spanish flu at this time, which was probably the last really severe pandemic that occurred and was so costly prior to COVID, right? It seems like about every century we deal with a major pandemic, and this is one that's often referenced. And it was a global pandemic, just like COVID was today, and it was spread, or it was probably perpetuated and made worse by World War I, right? Because you have all of these countries that are intermingling because of the war, because of malnutrition, right? That's going to affect people's immune systems. So it becomes a global pandemic. It hits the United States really, really bad as well. and millions die through that. So some of that, some of those deaths are part of that as well, Spanish flu. But that continues on past the war into 1918, 1919. So then we get to finally the end of combat, the armistice of November 11th, 1918. So no more fighting. And then the next year, 1919, at the beginning of 1919, there's the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles, which are really important here. So, at the official end of a war, you tend to sign treaties, you have a peace conference, an official declaration, and that usually involves some concessions by one side, or maybe both, but compromises, concessions, agreements. I mentioned, the Korean War never ended. There's just an armistice, right? So a treaty, Nilda, is sort of like an official agreement between two sides to end a war. And so that's what I mean. The armistice is an agreement of like a ceasefire, right? So it's like, okay, we're going to stop actively fighting. That's typically what an armistice is. A peace treaty is when you officially end the war and you come to certain compromises. So there's, for some reason, these usually wind up happening in Paris. There's multiple treaties of Versailles for different wars. There's different, the Treaty of Paris, that's where we signed the treaty to end the American Revolution. And within that treaty, that's where Britain cedes a bunch of territory to us, and you make other compromises. In this case, what happens with the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles, Germany basically gets blamed for the war. Now, you may remember just a few minutes ago, I told you how that war started. Germans didn't kill Franz Ferdinand. As a matter of fact, they were aligned with his country. But for some reason, they get blamed. I'm pretty sure it's just because of the devastation and the fact that they were pushing into France, and they were certainly aggressors. But it's very hard to, the fact that they were singled out, and that's really going to come back to bite the world later, because they have to give up territory. They are disarmed. They're supposedly they can't have a military, only like a security force, so they can protect themselves, but they can't build up a large military, and they owe a bunch of money. They have to pay for the war. They have to pay for the damages, and they only recently paid that off. That's how long it took. So Germany is embarrassed. Germany is broke. And when we get to this next week, that will give rise to one Adolf Hitler. So mistakes were made, let's put it that way, in signing these peace agreements. But yeah, so a treaty is just that formal agreement that the two sides, make as far as concessions, compromises, whatever it is to end the war. And like I said here, very harsh penalties that basically blames Germany for the war. So let's see here. Okay. Woodrow Wilson is the president at this time. I mentioned he was an isolationist. He did not want to, he campaigned on not dragging the United States into the war for his second election. But because what we talked about here as far as the different sort of antagonism towards the United States with Germany attacking shipping and the Zimmerman telegram, they had to eventually enter the war. Now, part of that, of course, is some public pressure from Americans once the idea of isolation became less popular, that they were going to be able to stay out of it. Some of it was the fact that Woodrow Wilson wanted to have a say in what the world order would look like in the post-World War I era. And in his mind, in his thinking, they were going to have some skin in the game. They were going to have to participate in the war if he was going to be influential in determining what that post-war idea was going to be. So towards the end of the war, after U.S. had been in the battle maybe close to a year, he issues these 14 points. And so I've kind of, obviously a paraphrase here, I only have like sort of 3 ideas, but what he issues in these 14 points is basically what he wants the post-World War I world order to look like. And he's promoting, this equality of trade and freedom of navigation of the seas between, these countries. Of course, that comes from the submarine warfare and the sinking of ships. Self-determination for people. So he's wanting those European nations to back off of their colonial holdings and give the people there more autonomy, more self-determination, more ability to determine their own lives, more democracy for those colonial powers. There was just horrible, other countries had gotten in on the whole colonialism idea around this time, and after the war, things really get bad for some colonies. Belgium becomes a colonial empire, little tiny Belgium. They are absolutely maybe the worst colonial empire of all time because of the way they treat the people of the Congo. It's just so bad. But he's looking towards sort of returning to those ideas of what the principles of the United States and its founding were, autonomy for people, self-determination, and the reduction of these colonial empires, which they believe, was another reason for the war, right? Everybody was carving up the world for themselves. Great Britain, France, Germany, all these powers were eating up the world. That was another thing that sort of embroiled them in this huge conflict. He also mentions taking it easy on Germany within those points. We can't just put all this on Germany. Of course, that's what winds up happening. And then I think it's the very last point that he makes. He mentions an association of nations, that we come together as a group with some sort of governing body to prevent, a crisis like this in the future. So he was the architect of the League of Nations. So you remember we've talked about the League of Nations several times, the precursor to the United Nations that comes along after World War II. The problem, though, is that it's weak. It's sort of the same problem that we have with the United Nations. No nation is going to give up their sovereignty and their own independence to be governed by a united nations, by a global governance. So the ability to get people, to sway people's opinions, or to get them involved in, changing the world, it's very difficult. It's still better that we have them than we don't. But here, the same kind of problems but they're probably steeper and deeper. Just a sort of a unwillingness to, exert a lot of energy into building the League of Nations. And also, even though he was the architect of that, Congress at the time, wanting to go back sort of their isolationist ways, refused to enter the League of Nations. So ironically, even though he was, and we saw the political cartoon, you might remember, where the bridge and the keystone in the center, that was one of the pieces. Now, would have things changed? Would have been stronger? What would have happened with the United States? Probably not a whole lot. But it is sort of ironic that because we didn't, who created it at the same time, did not participate in it. but that is World War One. And so next week we can look at the post-World War One era, the Roaring Twenties, and that's going to lead to the Great Depression. So we could maybe get to the Roaring Twenties, Great Depression, and maybe World War II in a class next week, and then we'll start, incorporating some maps, and we'll get back to language arts and do some more prep there as well. Any questions on this part of history? This is a big chunk of how we get to our world today, especially with World War I. Any questions? Anything that can help fill in the blanks with you? Nothing? All right. So more generally, is there